This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Welcome back to Season 5 of the Animal Highlights, where we're focused on animals and politics. All the content from this season has been extracted from Season 6 of the Animal Turn podcast, which is a season of the same name, Animals and Politics. This season, my co-host will be Virginia Thomas, who's an environmental social scientist. She was previously also a research fellow with the Wellcome Trust-funded project From Feed the Birds to Do Not Feed the Animals. In this episode, we talk all about maguey worms. Virginia speaks a little bit about the name and confusion around these caterpillars, as well as their history and how this insect became entangled with tequila drinking cultures. Enjoy. Hi, Virginia. Welcome back to the Animal Highlight.
Hi, good to be here again.
And who are we talking about today?
Well, we are going to be a bit playful this time. We're going to talk about a caterpillar with an interesting name. You and Angie spent a long time discussing what being cosmopolitan means, and you were very honest in saying that prior to encountering cosmopolitics, your personal understanding of cosmopolitanism related to those who live in cities. And I have my own association of the cosmopolitan with cocktails. So the Cosmopolitan's a famous cocktail, and I wanted to be a bit playful with this animal highlight by thinking about an animal in relation to an alcoholic drink, and then more seriously relate this to what Angie was talking about with respect to cosmopolitanism and multi-species justice. So I want to talk about the tequila worm. The worm that's sometimes found in a bottle of tequila. And there's so much to say here, but definitely the first thing to say is that the tequila worm isn't a worm.
What? What did you say?
The tequila also isn't tequila, but we're not here to do a drinks highlight, we're here to do an animal highlight. So we won't go into the tequila mezcal question, focus on the worm, or rather the caterpillar, because what people are actually referring to when they refer to the worm is a caterpillar. But just to be even more confusing, the caterpillars are called red maguey worms. So something which we might usually think of as a caterpillar because it's the larvae of a moth, we actually call a worm. But I just wanted to make it clear that when I say red maguey worm, I don't want people to think of what they might usually think of when they think of a worm. I want them to think of a caterpillar.
Got you. So a worm and a caterpillar are not the same thing.
No, they're actually different species.
Okay.
Worms are invertebrates, and there are lots of different kinds, including earthworms and parasitic worms, like roundworms and flatworms. Caterpillars are insects, but the maguey worm isn't the only caterpillar to be called a worm. There are quite a few others, and a common one is the inchworm. But going back to the red maguey worm, it feeds exclusively on the agave plant from which tequila or mezcal is made. And there's another caterpillar which eats this agave plant, the white maguey worm. But while maguey worms eat the agave plant, they in turn are eaten by people. And if we think about the idea of cosmopolitanism and interspecies justice, which you and Angie were discussing, we might think of this as the first breach of justice in relation to the red maguey worm. People consider them a food animal and turn them into a commodity. We might think about justice for the red maguey worm as involving moving from a system where they're eaten to one where they're granted rights to not be exploited by humans. Angie pointed out, however, that when considering multi-species justice, in some cases where people are reliant on animals for their subsistence, either for food or labour, a transition period might have to be considered where human exploitation of animals is phased out gradually rather than stopped abruptly, since a sudden change could result in considerable disadvantage to people, possibly even constituting a breach of their rights. But the red maguey worm isn't only exploited as a food source. In a case of metamorphosis, and we'll come on to its life cycle in a minute, it's morphed from a valuable food source into the tequila worm. And this change is a further commodification of the red maguey worm, and one that's even harder to defend, since through its role in the drinks trade, it's exploited purely to gratify human wants rather than needs, both for financial gain for the drinks trade and as a statement for those who participate in the drinking culture surrounding the tequila worm. But I wanted to talk about the life cycle of red maguey worms and the incredible metamorphosis which they and other caterpillars like them undergo. I've mentioned that the red maguey worm lives on and eats agave plants. They grow and develop for up to a year until they're ready to make a silk cocoon. They then pupate for about 6 weeks, after which they emerge as a moth. Then the moth lives only a few days, during which time the female lays her eggs on agave plants, which will hatch into caterpillars for the process to begin again. And given the potential of the caterpillar, something which is utterly different from any human capabilities, we might consider a cosmopolitics which recognises the right of the caterpillar to pupate and metamorphose into a moth, rather than ending up at the bottom of a bottle for human gratification.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a life stage. It's like cutting someone off before puberty and saying, that whole part of your life is unimportant. I mean, and this is putting aside the idea of killing and consuming the animals. I think, like you say, the potential to become something. And the what kind of moths can they become, or do they become?
So I could only find the, I think, Latin name for it. They're a small grey moth, and I believe it's pronounced or something like Comadia redtenbacheri.
That sounds better than what I was going to say. I was going to say Comadia red ten. Oh no, I was going to say red tenbacheri. So bacheri, I think, sounds much more professional, because I just looked them up now. They're quite beautiful, really. Like for me, it looks like a quintessential moth, right? With those 4 like grey white type wings, and they're quite fuzzy and fluffy.
Yeah, I probably was a bit dismissive calling them grey, perhaps silvery. Really, they look really velvety.
Yeah, they do.
And soft.
And they're kind of small. I was reading that they're about 12 to 15 millimeters. Maybe that's big for a moth, actually. Yeah, that's not insignificant, actually, if you think about it, for a moth. 12 millimeters. Although I'm really bad with math, so I don't know if what I'm doing with my fingers is actually a good indicator of the size of the moth.
Isn't it interesting that, was it Herd who said that, we recognize animals when they're big like us? So we're talking about whether the size of a moth makes it significant or not on an entirely human scale. If it was 12 centimeters, we might consider acknowledging it more than if it's 12 millimeters.
That's a really good point. And I'm happy you brought insects into the animal highlights so early on in the season, because I think insects are often neglected when we speak about animal highlights. And just the other day, I was speaking to my husband, Oliver, about, when you think about the physiology of an insect, how much is going on in something that tiny, and again, I'm bringing in size, but I think it just blows my mind to realize that you've got a whole system and a whole body working and a brain and everything happening at a scale that we can't quite comprehend, which I think is pretty remarkable.
Well, and the fact that they metamorphose, something we tend to have that. We have that tendency to measure things by human standards, don't we? Oh, can they use tools? Can they communicate verbally or with language? And if a non-human animal can't do that, then we dismiss it. But it's just the benchmark we're using. If we used a moth benchmark and said, well, can other animals go through this process of metamorphosis, humans would fail badly on that test.
But it's interesting because like metamorphosis is a kind of physiological change, right? And I think all animals do go through certain physiological changes, but their whole bodies don't change. They don't cocoon themselves up and come out from being a crawling being to being a flying being, which is pretty darn radical. And then isn't it, okay, I think I'm getting my science here from Perdido Street Station, which is a fictional book. So if it's wrong, I apologize. But if I'm not mistaken, when they're in the cocoons, their whole bodies, they actually become really, like their whole bodies like they become almost like liquefied. That's going to be, I have to double check all of this and put it in the show notes. But because they have to actually, they tear themselves apart to come together again, right? Like it's incredible what goes on. I need to check that. I should have said that before saying it on a podcast, but I'm pretty certain that this is what happens when you learn from fictional books. So don't quote me on that.
I learn all my best history from fiction.
I really, really love reading fiction, like fictional history. I've gotten super into that recently. Coming back to insects, though, I just wanted to say that I'm really delighted that you brought them up also because I think the consumption of insects is a really important matter that's being discussed increasingly now. A lot of people concerned with climate change, for example, are saying, well, we need to look into how we can make use of insects to create food and food to feed human populations in the future. And on the other hand, you've got a whole bunch of kind of philosophers and ethicists coming forward and saying, hang on, what do we really know about the social lives of insects and their sentience? Can we do this in a way that is ethical and responsible, or are we just creating a whole host of more exploitative industries?
That's a really good point because, yeah, I think there is a real rush towards insect protein as we try to move away from a more carbon-intensive agricultural system. But there's huge amounts of work now on the sentience of insects, and I think we dismiss them too readily. As we were saying, they're small and to from a human perspective, perhaps insignificant. So, and I mean the moth we're talking about today and the caterpillar we're talking about today, perhaps even aren't the best examples because they're still quite charismatic from an insect perspective. You know, there are, if we think of ladybirds or ladybugs, whatever people like to call them, you know, we tend to like them, but just because they're charismatic and they appear in children's storybooks. And we like moths and butterflies because they're beautiful. But we have very different attitudes to other forms of insects. And I think the ones that are commonly considered as potential for food are ones that, yeah, we wouldn't consider charismatic and would be very or potentially comfortable to eat if we were comfortable with the idea of them being edible.
And also just to bring forward kind of the cultural dimensions, which I think you're pointing to here about the tequila worm or the misnamed tequila worm, is how much it's attached to different, like the consumption of insects is also attached squarely to quite different cultures, different heritages. You know, you travel across Asia, you are encountering insects in a wide range of cuisines. So sometimes I think in the West, we have this idea that the consumption of insects is like this new and novel thing that's happening right now. Same thing with I think protein, alternative protein and meat consumption generally. People are like, wow, it's so new. And you're like, hang on. They've been, you know, in China, they've been creating fake meats for a long, long, long time. And across Asia, there's been consumptions of a variety of insects. So it's interesting to think how the animals are kind of positioned within food systems historically. But still, I think what you're talking about with the worm and what we're talking about here with the insects is this kind of industrialization of eating insects. And these worms in the tequila are, well, not in the tequila, it's in the what is it called? Mezcal?
Yeah, mezcal?
Mezcal. Tequila can be mezcal can't be tequila. The worms in mezcal, you know, we were just looking before the show that it's a $97 billion industry, the tequila industry. So how are the worms kind of caught up in this? Or how are the caterpillars caught up in this? Are they just accidentally harvested or are they actively inserted into bottles? Do you know?
No, they're actively inserted. It's not something I've ever seen, but you know, you will have a bottle of mezcal and there will be a caterpillar at the bottom of it. And the idea is you're supposed to drink it. And apparently it's a relatively new thing. It's not as if this is something that's, you know, embedded in cultural histories. And I don't know enough about it in Mexico where it originated, but certainly in the West, you know, there's a lot of machismo in the drinking culture around this, which is associated with tequila more broadly anyway, and the kind of drinking culture that we have.
Yeah, no, like it's interesting to think about how these different animals kind of get caught up in in consumption and a variety of consumption. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked with thinking about insects and consumption. Really incredible caterpillars, and for anyone interested in metamorphosis and how caterpillars become butterflies and moths, maybe you can give me a lesson on how it happens, but I'm going to go and do some reading about it now. Maybe you should too. Thanks so much, Virginia.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much to Virginia Thomas for being an incredible co-host, and to Rebecca Shen for her work on the logo and all the artwork done with the animal highlight. The show was edited and produced by myself. This is The Animal Highlight with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.